Hello everyone, this is Tom Uren and I'm here with a special edition of Between Two Nerds. The Grugq and I were invited to speak at the NATO CyCon conference in Tallinn. Before I drop you into that live podcast, I'd just like to thank our sponsor SpectreOps, creator of the Bloodhound attack path analysis tool. Find them at spectreops.io. Now here's our live podcast in Estonia.
So this event, we're clearly at a conference on cyber conflict, and the theme is securing tomorrow. So I happen to have this 8-year-old paper that I thought we should discuss. And
securing yesterday.
So this is a paper I co-wrote back in 2018, and it's Australia's offensive cyber capability. And as a background, Australia had recently declared that it had an offensive cyber capability that, to make sure we're all on the same page, people here have called it cyber effects, but it's also a sort of pithy way of describing it is deny, degrade, destroy, what's the other one?
Deceive, discombobulate, defenestrate.
And they were, at the time, the Australian Defence Department was planning to spend some percentage of GDP on this capability. So like even a small amount of a country's GDP is a lot of money. And they commissioned us to write this paper, and it really reflects what the Australian Defence Force was thinking at the time about offensive cyber. And it was, a lot of it, I think, was to reassure regional neighbours. We're going to spend a lot of money on this, like really a lot of money, but it's going to be okay because we'll use it responsibly. And it has actually a really nice section that we'll step through, which has the strengths that they thought of offensive cyber at the time, and it also has the weaknesses. And so this paper was released in 2018, and since then we've really learnt a lot about how militaries are actually using offensive cyber capabilities. So we'll kind of, in a way, grade my paper and also see if it tells us what we can learn about the future. So this, the ADF, the Australians, we're part of the Five Eyes. We think we're pretty good at cyber. So the internal perception would be this is a sophisticated view of what the capabilities were back in 2018. So what I'll do is I'll kick off. I'm not going to read the whole paper, don't worry.
Once upon a time.
By reading the first strengths. For military tasks, these can be integrated with ADF operations, adding a new capability and creating a force multiplier.
Oh yeah, sounds reasonable. Next. I think that was probably very optimistic, particularly at the time.
So now, the things I think of this is that yes, it can be. So for example, we've got the taking down Viasat at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The Russians took down a ISP at the same time.
Yeah, and they did huge numbers of wiper attacks against government ministries, and they interfered with the ability of the government to operate as a normal government. But
so that seems like a force multiplier.
Yeah, but they're under wartime conditions, not a normal government. Like that's, like it could be a force multiplier, but the problem is that, I guess, there's so much civilian infrastructure that can be repurposed as like civil infrastructure, right? So, for example, when Zelensky starts using Facebook to send messages to the people, like, yeah, his email might be wiped, but that's not necessarily giving you, you are not achieving decapitation by interfering with his official email address.
Okay, so in recent months, we've had the story is that intelligence from Tehran's traffic cameras and mobile phone towers was used to target the supreme leader, and actually
that's
probably
how they determined all their war-winning and strategic effects.
But surely that is also a force multiplier, right? They achieved a particular tactical goal, which was to eliminate the supreme leader, based on the intelligence. And they also, the story is they took down a mobile phone tower so that the
warnings couldn't get out.
Yeah,
look, there's a lot of ways that, particularly during the start of a So like before a war actually gets going, when you've had time to pre-position, and you've had time to sort of plan out and say, here's what we're going to do at this particular time to achieve this effect, there's no friction at that point. There's no difficulties necessarily in achieving that. But once you're beyond that point, like once you've gotten beyond being able to pre-position and pre-plan and everything, when it's actually like a organic war with both sides involved and friction and all of these issues, I question how much of a force multiplier it can be, simply because there aren't that many computers in a trench. And similarly, the ability to, like, if you're a cyber commander and you go to your general and you say, look, we can assist you with your operations, give us 2 to 6 months notice, and a 3-week window after that, we can tell you that we'll be able to maybe do something for either 15 minutes or possibly 6 hours. We can't quite tell. However,
so one of the weaknesses, in fact, the first weakness, is that capabilities need to be highly tailored to be effective, such as the stucknet worm that targeted around nuclear centrifuges, meaning that they can be expensive to develop and lack flexibility. So that actually hits on exactly the point.
Except that's wrong.
How's it wrong?
Okay, so I think one of the things that we've seen is that that sort of high-end capability does need to be highly tailored. But what people are using are not that sort of high-end capability. Like like a wiper isn't that sophisticated, right?
Okay, but like going back to the like Viasat thing, right? That seems a bit more like this. Like tailored to a particular network, to a particular time, to achieve an effect that covered Ukraine and a few other countries.
Yeah, like it wasn't tailored enough, I would say, right? But but all they did was they downloaded bad firmware. Like that's not months and months of development. It's not millions of dollars of research. Like it's tailored, but in the sense of like giving something to a hacker for a weekend to work on.
Okay.
Like it's
so there's a couple of other examples I can think of. One is in Venezuela. There's reports that when the US nabbed, what's his name, President Maduro, they flicked the lights, and that under cover of darkness, they were able to perform the operation more safely. So that seems like a multiplier, but a very small multiplier, right?
Yeah, because, the US was really under threat from Venezuela. And if they hadn't turned out the lights, they would have lost an aircraft carrier. It's a force multiplier when it's already like an elephant versus a gnat.
To be fair, I think it's a useful capability to have, right? If you can turn it off, it is better to turn it off with a cyber operation than it is to blow up.
Make cyber not war.
Right, yes. So one of the other things that I think you've already touched upon is that for operations short of cyber attacks, and this is another weakness, the effects can be relatively short-lasting and limited. So the paper is a bit, to be honest, confused, because it says that they're talking about cyber attacks that degrade, destroy, deny, discombobulate. But in fact, those tend to be relatively short-lived as well.
And one of the things that doesn't come up here is that those, like the 5D sort of capabilities, ignoring the C for a minute, those are actually heavily dependent on psychological effects as well, which gets overlooked. So if you have ever been hacked, then you know that the first time it happens, it's very distressing. And then the second time, it's not distressing, but it's very annoying. And the third time, it's just kind of annoying, right? It goes from this is the worst thing that's ever happened to it's a Tuesday.
Wow, you really do get hacked a lot more.
Yeah. So the thing is, if you're destroying someone's infrastructure and it's the first time that's ever happened to them, they feel violated, they've never had to go through the process of rebuilding, they're not sure where to start, who's in charge, what they should do first, and then they learn all of that, and so the next time you do it, they go, oh, what did we do last time? And they go through the playbook. And then if you do it again after that,
So you're saying that it's not only temporary, but it's also decays over time. So even if you can do the same thing a different way, or they haven't patched or whatever, it's just less effective over time.
Absolutely.
So, okay, the second strength, because we've talked a lot about weaknesses, they can engage targets that can't be reached with conventional capabilities without causing unacceptable collateral damage or overt acknowledgement. So that seems like it's true.
Yeah, well, I think you can actually, it's a little bit more interesting than that, because you have to take, well, maybe this buries the lead, right? There are entities that exist which cannot be hit kinetically, right? So if you take a telco, it's made up of physical infrastructure and people and equipment and all that. But it's also just a cyber entity that's made up of databases and computers and so on.
So you can take out a tower, but you can't take out...
Right. You could wipe a data center, you could wipe a headquarters.
With a missile on it.
Sorry, yeah, you could blow these things up without taking out the telco. But on the other hand, you can take out the telco with, wipers and ransomware. However, as we've seen, there's a limited duration. Like you do hit these diminishing returns of like...
Right, so you're talking, I guess, in particular about Kyivstar, which was wiped, a couple of years ago now?
Yeah, December of 23, I believe, yep.
And you think that the actual impact of that was what?
People had to cross the road and buy a SIM card for another network.
So my take at the time was that was a counterproductive operation, because if you're in a telco, there's just so many opportunities for intelligence collection that...
So I agree, but I think that...
and I guess the point was that like the first strength was creating a force multiplier. And in that case, it seemed like there wasn't any force to multiply.
Right. So like that gets back to the thing of like when cyber creates an effect, that's only useful if you can exploit it. Right? Otherwise, it's an effect that sort of comes and goes, and to what end? Nothing, right? So unless it's exploited, it's basically a waste. Unless there's something that you're getting out of it, you're just wasting capability. But as we've said, it decays over time. So you're not just wasting capability, you're making it less effective the next time. But even more so, back to what I was saying earlier, you cannot actually exploit that effect because friction will interfere with the timing.
Right. So one hypothesis there is they would have liked to have wiped Kyivstar at a different time to combine it with a conventional military operation, and they just weren't lined up? Or...
Well, no, I mean, for everyone who's not Russia, you would like to be able to do an effect and then exploit it. But I think in the case of Kyivstar, the directive wasn't so much a strategic decision as a political decision, right? So I'm not sure if anyone's aware of this, but a lot of the time, organizations do not necessarily make decisions with pure strategy and the national, right? There's occasions where there might be internal politics, or someone's a bit tired and makes the wrong decision and then doubles down because they don't want to look dumb, and any number of things can happen. But it turns out that probably happens with the enemy as well. And in this case, my suspicion is that the need to appear to be participating in the counter-value campaign was stronger than the need to deliver usable intelligence. And so they made a poor strategic decision for very rational political reasons.
Right.
Which obviously would never happen outside of Russia.
There's another interesting example just recently, in Operation Midnight Hammer, which was the US, they either successfully or unsuccessfully blew up Iran's nuclear program about a year ago. We can only presume unsuccessfully because we're in another war about it. The claim is that they disrupted some router. It sounds like a router, and that enabled air defenses to go down.
Right.
So that seems like a force multiplier. Finally.
Yes. I guess. I mean, but given that cost, would they have been better off doing drones like the Israelis did?
Right.
So, I think this is.
But I mean, the particular case was like, I think it was it B-2 bombers, something like that. So very specific bombers with specific types of bunker buster munitions hitting a small hole somewhere in the ground.
I mean, like.
So it seems like switching off air defense would be very nice.
Right. So I'm not going to say that cyber is never useful because I don't believe that. But I think every time that it gets pushed into a situation where it's a substitute for kinetics, that's not playing to cyber strengths. Like cyber strengths are not like, it's like a missile but invisible, or, like that's not what it's particularly good at. So whenever these operations come up where they're like, we will use it to do missile-like things, but at the click of a button, which, that's not where the value is, and it's like square peg in a round hole sort of thing.
Yep. So the example the Australians have talked about, the actual action took place a couple of years before this paper was written, and they only spoke about it, I think, in 2023. But they talked about how in Iraq, they were supporting a military movement, and was it Iraq? ISIS, Daesh people had mobile phones, and they wanted to disrupt the mobile phones' communications, and so they had something to just disconnect it from the internet. So that seems like if you're going to spend an extra percent, not a percent, but an extra huge amount, it's like, well, we're going to turn people's phones off, and they could. The effect was so temporary that if the terrorists rebooted their phone, they would work again.
Right.
and then they came up with another capability that would just brick the phone. So that was the quick response capability.
Right.
So that seems like, that's kind of useful. Is it a force multiplier? I think you would achieve the exact same operation
right.
without turning people's phones off.
Is it decisive?
No.
No. Is it fun? Yeah. So
it seems to me that if you've got, like, they would have been, there's incentives to be on those phones.
Right.
In those terrorist networks for intelligence gathering purposes, right?
Sure.
And so if you can go, okay, turning them off at the exact right time, that would be nice. It seems like the marginal cost of doing that is actually, like, the opportunity cost is the biggest cost.
Right.
It's not let's spend an extra.
Well, it's not like you're going to get a lot of ongoing information from a suicide bomber. Like, at some point you'll run out of, like, the opportunity cost is quite limited because their future sort of.
Well, and I mean, also in the original conception, they would just reboot their phone anyway. Right. So it's a win-win. So they provide global reach. That, to me, it seems fair enough. Like, you can hack anywhere on the planet. But then I think about the number of militaries that want to
right.
have global reach, right?
Yeah, it's like, just because you can hack anywhere in the world, it doesn't, like, unless you have force projection that allows you to go anywhere in the world to take advantage of that, what's the point? I mean, sorry, I strongly endorse doing that because cyber is very cool and all, but it's hard to see why that would be a big selling point. Like, if you can't send a lot of people to, I don't know, Iceland to do something, being able to hack Iceland isn't necessarily a great capability.
Yeah, so it feels like there's a small number of countries, US, China, other countries with aspirations.
Yeah, it's like Australia, global... one of the great global powers.
Yeah. They provide an asymmetric advantage against an adversary for a relatively modest cost.
I thought they had to be highly tailored and expensive.
So yeah, they're to be honest, there are different parts that say different things. So for example, in the paper, for a relatively modest cost, and I think in this part of the paper they're talking about compared to, say, buying $50 billion worth of submarines from the US. which is a thing that Australia is doing.
Yeah. Well, it's cheaper than shooting down drones with Bugattis or whatever it is, like Lamborghinis.
Right.
But so here's one of the examples I have in my dissertation, which is, in my opinion, the Destroyer 2 attacks by Russia in October. So in October of 2022, there was 2 sets of attacks by the Russians that managed to turn off the grid in Ukraine for a few hours each. And in my opinion, that was an absolute disaster for the agency that did that. Because beforehand, you could say, yes, we have this capability, we could turn off the grid, we're invisible masters, we can come and we can do all this ninja stuff.
Like when you don't show them the monster in the horror movie.
Right. And then you get a chance to do it, and it turns out you can turn off the lights for 4 hours.
Right.
After 2 months of work with however many people, and you turn off the lights for 4 hours. That is an absolute disaster. Right? If they hadn't succeeded, it would have been so much better. They could have gone, if only we'd gotten through, then you would have seen something. But instead, it turns out that they're less effective than, a kilo of dynamite. It's
Right. Yeah, so that hits upon a couple of things. I mentioned before that you need to be highly tailored, but it also relatively short-lasting and limited. I think there's another weakness here that capability can't be showcased as a deterrent in the same way that conventional capability can, because revealing specific capability renders it redundant as defenses are repaired. So I guess that hits upon they're more likely to be resilient as you continue to hit them. I guess this is the use it or lose it, or use it and lose it.
So I would say that what you should probably do is you should have a parade, and then you could have goose-stepping hackers. Keyboards over the shoulder,
One of the final strengths is they can be overt or clandestine, depending upon the intended effect. Now, my impression is that there's a number of countries that do relatively a lot of actual operations, and we hear about a small number of that are made public. Right. So until maybe the last year or two, the US, they've spoken about, have they spoken about it? I've heard about them disrupting ransomware groups, not the public parts, but the secret spooky parts.
Yep.
They've talked about the Iranian decapitation strike.
Yep.
And when I say they, I mean that people have leaked it to the press. And then also the nuclear strike. So it seems like there's this steady drip, drip, drip. The UK, I've heard of a couple of stories, and Australia then a couple of stories. The one I mentioned before, and another case where they said there was a big data leak in Australia. The hackers got into medical records, and they did really nasty things like releasing lists of people who'd had psychological problems or really sensitive medical issues. And so Australia went and wiped the bulletproof hosting service. And then the way the Australian Signals Directorate does it is they'll just talk to a reporter and say, we waited until they were out drinking. And they're in this town in Russia. They go out drinking, we wiped their hosting server. And so it's got all the elements of a little bit of personal, intrigue, and they sort of wrap it up in a nice bow. But it seems like each country has got a different approach to whether they want it to be clandestine or overt.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things of cyber is very, very different depending on the political context. And so to a degree, this is why I've always thought the discussion of is cyber escalatory? That's not a useful discussion to have, because it's not the technology that determines if it's escalatory. It's the use of that technology given the political context, right? So things like it's useful to be clandestine and not to be attributed. That is true at some points in time. But if you're, for example, in a shooting war, it no longer matters, right? So all of that framework of like how to reason about cyber
Right. Yep.
is bound up in the political context of peacetime below threshold, capability. And once you cross that, so much shifts and changes that those frameworks cease to be useful. They're just irrelevant.
Yeah, so one of the things here, weakness, achieving the appropriate specificity and proportionality requires investment of time and effort. And there's basically a statement in here that, like, Australia would never do something as terrible as WannaCry or NotPetya because we're the good guys, basically. And but that seems to be a concern of the time.
Right.
Like, no one ever talks about we are using cyber proportionately and responsibly. The US has talked about normalizing it. Mm-hmm. And all the operations you see are like, they've as have appeared in the press at least, are like, I would say perfectly fine. They're proportionate within like targeted.
Yeah, but could you do something disproportionate in cyber, for example?
Well, WannaCry. NotPetya. Probably
those were mistakes, though, both of them. Like they weren't intentional.
Yeah, but you can do disproportionate.
I mean, even Stuxnet escaped, right? So yeah, like those were not state policy. Mm-hmm. To quote the Dr. Strangelove, right? Those were not that was not an intended effect, and it is entirely possible for anyone to write malware that misbehaves. So certainly it's more likely that, one of the bad actors who doesn't put that much effort into making sure it's all done right and doing testing and whatever, it's more likely they would get it wrong than, NSA. But again, it's not state policy. So I still wonder if it's, could you do something that terrible?
So overall, I think the paper, I'm proud to say, I think it actually holds up pretty well.
Yep.
So I guess the question is, almost 8 years ago, this was sophisticated thinking. Now, the things that I think have really changed are the rise of AI, very recently, and also the rise of drones.
Right.
And so those are two things that people in ASD were never going to think about. They're totally out of the blue. It's impossible to know back then that they would happen, right?
Right. So if you were to go back to, 2018 and you said, all right, imagine the year 2026. Which of these two scenarios is more likely? One, memory corruption exploits are dead. Or two, Pwn2Own has so many entrants they have to turn people away, leading to a flood of people dropping ODAs in public. Right? It's it has blindsided people with coming out of nowhere. But then again, I guess the question with AI is, how big is the change going to be when it settles down? Is it going to, are we going to be having this endless stream of ODAs forever? Or is it going to burn itself out and then we'll be in a bare space with fewer things?
My gut feeling is that it will burn out.
Yeah.
Because I'm a forest fire kind of a guy. But
yes,
I just can't believe that there's infinite bugs in a piece of software because it's not infinitely.
You are not a developer.
Yeah. So so to be honest, this is just my total personal belief system.
Yep.
I also don't believe that AI will be infinitely smart, but you talk to AI people who work for Anthropic and they go, yeah, you're screwed. You're obsolete. And so those are, I guess in terms of predicting the future, I have absolutely no basis to believe what I believe, except for
right.
So, me.
Yeah, on predicting the future, right? So would you say that if we were to take however many predictions or the things that you put down 8 years ago, if you were to do that same exercise today, and then we come back in another 8 years, and you were to look at them, would you say, oh, wow, I could see how at the time these were important, but obviously we were missing whatever big things? Or would you say, oh, we had really, in that initial 8-year period, we'd learned a lot. so that the next step was much tighter and much closer.
Right. I think, like, thinking about the paper, I think it got a lot of conceptual things right. I think in practice, what has happened is that the clever, intricate Rube Goldberg operations occur right at the beginning of conflicts. Mm-hmm. And that means that I think the number of countries that are going to launch surprise attacks is like on other countries and have the capacity to do that kind of planning and development is like pretty small.
Right. And I'd say that making that even smaller is that a lot of the countries that would be doing that are developing nations on other developing nations.
Right.
Until you get to like China and Taiwan, or, I guess Brussels and Luxembourg.
So China, Taiwan, I think there is a thing to be worried about, right? But in terms of like the actual, so we're looking at it in the sort of cyber domain, offensive cyber. And right now, if you said to me, what I would predict that would happen is that people will gradually know that the offensive cyber in particular has got strengths and weaknesses. Obviously. It seems like we've been going through this, there was that while of cyber Pearl Harbor. I think a British general said that, we won't need tanks, we'll just have cyber. And I think people have gotten over that, but it still hasn't settled down.
Right. So like everyone was very excited. Then there was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where the cyber war that was predicted didn't show up, and everyone got very depressed because it turns out that cyber is not decisive in war winning.
That was one of the weaknesses that we didn't get to.
Right. And then the Americans start using cyber in these sort of overwhelming operations, and people get excited again, like, see, we told you. And it seems, I don't know, it does seem to be oscillating between extremes, and it's like they're both wrong, right? Cyber is weaker than its proponents think it is, but stronger than its detractors claim.
Right. Well, that's time up. So thanks very much, everyone. I just wanted to have the last word and say that before you enter warfare, I think that cyber espionage is actually tremendously important and powerful, and that adding offensive cyber to that capability seems like a no-brainer, because you can do different things for not very much extra money. I think it probably doesn't make sense to spend billions of dollars on destructive cyber.
I'm going to push back a little bit. I strongly recommend hiring outside consultants for billions of dollars, particularly podcast hosts with a broad vision of...
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks a lot.